Welcome back to Curious Now from the Center for Medical Simulation. I'm Jenny Rudolph, an organizational behavior scholar interested in all the interesting things behind what we say and do. So today on Curious Now, we're going to focus on sort of the power of making standards explicit. And it seems so academic in a way, but I'm hoping to make the argument that when we have clear standards, we can cool down the argument in a good way and add some light. So we can cool down the heat and bring up the light a little bit. I'm really delighted to have a partner in crime today, and that is Dr. Gabriel Reedy, who is the editor-in-chief of Advances in Simulation. And he also is the program director of the Masters in Clinical Education at King's College London, where he thinks a lot about how do you develop people's skills as clinical educators. He also has a PhD in cognitive and educational science. And part of why I'm so happy that you're here today, Gabe, is that I think of you as having spent a lot of time sorting through what are the standards that people might apply to what's a good paper when they submit it to Advances in Simulation, or what's a good master's thesis, or what are we helping students move toward? So welcome, and love to hear any thoughts you have, quick reactions to the general topic we're on.
Well, thanks, Jenny. It's great to be here. Looking forward to talking to you today about this. And you're absolutely right. The work that we do across health professions education and more broadly in sort of behavioral science as we think about healthcare is constantly, thinking about how do we help create the conditions for people to thrive, to do better, to provide good quality care and safe care for patients. And that requires that we are thinking about standards. And if we're going to help each other, help our colleagues keep getting better at what they do, we have to know what better looks like. So I'm excited to talk to you today about that.
Thank you. And I love that you've pointed us in the direction of mastery, getting better, etc. So at Curious Now, every episode we have a readiness goal, which is what are you going to be able to do by the end of this? And today's readiness goal is we really want you to be able to notice as the heat goes up in a meeting or a conversation, possibly a debriefing, and it's unclear why it is getting hot. So detect that. And then use the skills and ideas that we're going to discuss today to try to identify what is the standard behind the heat. Because we think if you can identify through curious questioning or exploration with other people what it is they care about, then it's so much easier to be clear together about what is the disagreement and or how do we find common ground. And as you noted just now, Gabe, how do we get better? So, Gabe, what I wanted to get your take on a little bit and wrestle with today is how does making standards explicit? And what do I mean by a standard? Like, what does a good feedback conversation look like is the standard we're thinking about today, for example. But it could be equally what is a good lumbar puncture, or what is a good goals of care conversation with a family of a patient who is in the ICU, or what are the criteria for hiring our next marketing manager? Those are all examples of standards. And what I'm interested in is what happens between people when performance isn't quite what we hoped it would be. And I think there's this sort of implicit tension sometimes, because if we appeal to an explicit standard like a rubric, so for example, we developed the advocacy inquiry rubric to help people master advocacy inquiry. A lot of people think of rubrics and checklists as like they're bureaucratic, they're reductionistic, they can be very punitive. Yet I think they also can kind of reduce the heat, as I said, and they can sort of increase clarity and create some fairness. And so I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on the costs and benefits of that from the multiple places where you do work, looking at research, looking at articles, developing master's students. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. I mean, some good points, and I think rubrics absolutely can help us in this effort. I mean, if I think about you know clinicians who are working with me to do a master's in education, they want to become better teachers and givers of feedback and clinical supervisors and maybe deans or program directors themselves. They want to get better at doing all of the work that is associated with education in the health professions. And rubrics give us an opportunity to clarify what it means, what we're looking for, what the standard is for mastery at those in within those domains. And I think it helps us give not just clarity of expectations, but also clarity around the judgment when the work is, provided. When you're writing a master's dissertation, or you're writing a master's thesis, an assignment or a piece of work for a postgraduate program, the folks who assess it also have to know, what am I assessing it against? And making those standards explicit in a rubric is pretty key to that. It helps ensure that we're fair across cohorts of students from one to the next, so that the expectations that one group of students have, and the performance that they provide is the same as the next group, is the same as the next group, or at least they're broadly similar. But also, I think it really helps us, especially a good rubric kind of abstracts performance, such that you can look across different kinds of students. So the work that some of my colleagues in nursing, as nursing educators, do, the sort of day-to-day on the ground work that they do as nursing educators, might be different to some of the work that my colleagues who are dietitians do, or some of our colleagues who are doctors do. And so looking at those different kind of instantiations or examples of educational work, how do we compare them? And of course, the standard helps us do that, which I think is really, really important. So fairness, not just over time, but across different groups of learners. um the flip side for me, I always think rubrics can be problematic. I think especially problematic in nuanced domains of practice, right? Or complex sets of behaviors, where you're talking about something that's quite difficult to distill into a clear sort of set of behaviors, or a list of behaviors. So the more complex the domain, the more nuanced it gets, the more difficult it is actually to develop a rubric that helps you feel confident about the application of that rubric, or the standard that it creates. I think the other thing that I really have come to a much better appreciation of, the longer that my career has gone on, is that most of our fields of practice are really dynamic in nature, right? So they're continually changing and developing and growing. And so the idea of a standard as static, and as once it's set, it's done. You can set it and forget it, and then you move on from there. It is really problematic, I think, in most of the domains that we're talking about. So standards have to be continually like examined, held up to scrutiny, continually developed as the fields change, and as our practice changes and develops, and updated, so that we are, and then of course communicated, because if we don't, then somebody's performing to a standard that is not the standard that we're all agreeing on now. They're two versions ago. So I think that's really important.
So, on that note, Gabe, I want to kind of talk about the stability and clarity that standards provide,
Mm.
posed against the rigidity and punitive side of them. And recently, I've been reading a book by Ann Curzon, who's a wonderful linguist and professor at University of Michigan, and she has a book called Says Who? A funner, kinder, something else guide to everybody who cares about language. And I found the book very, I'll even use the word threatening, but certainly destabilizing to me in a way because my daughters, knowing me so well, gave me a mug that says, I'm silently judging your grammar. Um, and I am constantly silently judging everybody's grammar. And I know what the standard is for where a preposition should go and when one should say who and whom, and whether you should say he, she, or they, in my not at all humble opinion. And what's fascinating in Anne Curzon's book is she refers to people like me as a grammando, um, and your inner grammando. And she gently skewers us grammandos by saying that language, like what you were just saying, is dynamic and changing, and common use is legitimate use, and that you don't get to sit on your high horse and silently judge other people's grammar because it's not really helpful to clarity in what you're writing. It's not necessarily helpful in clarity to what you're speaking. And it's almost, like certain kinds of manners or so on. It's a distinguisher of groups and class and all these other kinds of things. So I've really been struggling with this book because intellectually, I completely agree with her. Like, I feel like I should dial back my inner grammando for sure. But emotionally, I feel quite destabilized. As I said, like, if the rule isn't the rule, then what am I supposed to do? And so, with that very long run up there, Gabe, what I'm interested in is your experience sort of at the group level or the team level or the community level of standards in the wild. Because I know you've worked, for example, across the European community on developing a research program for the International Society for Simulation in Europe and so on. I mean, the Society for Simulation in Europe, CSAM, and uh, other entities that you work with. And I think having some standards is so key for knowing all the things we just discussed, but they can be kind of used as a bludgeon also. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I can see how that's confronting as a probably a little bit of a grammando myself. Um, I think that dynamism and that the nature of the standards is determined, um, like the nature of the practice and the nature of the standard and the community are all related. So, for a linguist perspective, as you've highlighted, the nature of the practice is we're communicating with each other, and so the use, is defined by how we all communicate with each other.
That's so
Um, eh,
legit,
yeah,
Gabe, as my daughters would say.
that's it. But I think in other communities, the nature of the community is different, the nature of the domain is different, and therefore the nature of the standard is different. And as an example, I mean, one of the things that emerged recent in the grand scheme of things during COVID was, you know, people were teaching each other or reminding each other of the importance of hand hygiene, and we were pulling out resources to help sort of draw people in who needed to kind of participate in patient care in different ways. And all of these resources, we were going, oh, wait a minute, that's not actually the standard that we teach now for hand hygiene, or that's not the standard we teach now for um, another kind of common practice. The standards have changed actually, and we don't all share that. We don't all sort of realize that. And you think of something as simple as hand washing and go, well, how? I mean, your hands are clean or they're not. But actually, what we know is that the standards really do make a difference. From a different, perspective entirely. One of the things I often talk to colleagues about when they're thinking about undertaking and then publishing research in the simulation world is that 15 years ago you could create a new simulation course, a new simulation intervention, test it out with your residents or your trainee nurses or your trainee physiotherapists, collect a little bit of data on it, write a manuscript up and get it submitted into a journal, and it would get published. And you could legitimately say things like, what we found was that simulation did just as good a job, or maybe even a little bit better job than we used to do teaching the same thing in another format. Uh, and the standard now for simulation research is much, much higher. You can't get that same work published anymore. It doesn't help us advance the field. And so the standard of the field really has moved on. It's changed. We don't need any more studies that show, for instance, that simulation works. We know simulation works. We know simulation helps people to develop their skills, helps them to develop quite complex situated skills like communication skills, like team working together in a team in a complex patient care setting. We know that sim works for this stuff. We don't need to prove it anymore. And so the bar becomes higher. The standard becomes actually how are you contributing to knowledge within the simulation world. You've got to give us something that really pushes our knowledge forward, and those kind of studies don't do it anymore. So as a community and as a group, we're pushing the bar higher and saying you need to do more if you're going to contribute to knowledge, actually, because that's where we are as a field. And I think every so often the resuscitation standards get updated and revised, and it's a similar situation. So our standards for for how we do what we do when we're taking care of someone who's very, very seriously unwell changes, and we change those guidelines based on the data that's gathered from hundreds of resuscitations that are done around the world in various settings, and we use that to help us update the standards. And I think those are the kinds of um, collaborative efforts that I think really help to advance sort of what we do.
So, Gabe, I want to pick up on a theme implicit in what you were just saying, which is how expertise or expert knowledge is incorporated into standards.
Mm,
And I'm going to use that observation also to pivot to talking a little bit with you about a specific rubric, which is the advocacy inquiry rubric, which we recently published in Advances in Simulation with the help of wonderful reviewers from your team. And our goal with that rubric was to incorporate international expertise in debriefing into the rubric because people often really struggle to learn debriefing, full stop,
mhm,
feedback conversations, full stop. And for those of us who think that preview advocacy inquiry is a useful micro skill in debriefing, it's been difficult to coach because exactly what is good has been a little bit fuzzy. And so Clément Bouillon, who led this study, talked to about 40 international experts in a Delphi structured elicitation of what are the specific behaviors in a good preview statement, observation, point of view statement, inquiry statement, and what does it look like when you listen well. And one of our big goals with this study, as articulated by my other colleague, Damien Shield, who worked on it, is you can get Gabe Reedy or you can get Jenny Rudolph or you can get somebody to give you feedback on your advocacy inquiry, but finding that person, getting the time, et cetera, is very difficult. So we thought that in the age of competency-based medical education and nurses and nursing education moving toward commitment to competency-based education as well in many health professions, having a way to build expertise into feedback conversations for faculty so they could get better and reduce the bottleneck of how you get better could be accomplished to some degree with a rubric. And so that was a lot of our driving interest there. It's also possible and likely that with that kind of expertise, you can now do some back end programming with a generative large language model or GPT of some sort so that you can also give feedback. The tension I see based on what you were talking about is how do we use the efficiency of building expertise into rubrics, whether it's how do you do a resuscitation, like resuscitate a patient in VTAC or some other arrhythmia, or how do you do a good debriefing conversation, feedback conversation with the benefit of that built-in expertise versus the dynamism that you were talking about, Gabe. Thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a real challenge. I think, what you have done by bringing that expertise together is, I think, exactly what should be done in communities like we work in, where we're drawing together that expertise and saying, okay, well, let's put this to use so that we can determine what does good, what does competency look like, and what does good performance look like. And I love the idea that what we're doing in that process is democratizing sort of good practice. We are enabling, we're giving people the tools they need in order to develop their own skills and to hold each other to high standards, so that they're providing a good experience for their learners, they're developing themselves, and they're building up their skills. And I think you're absolutely right that the corollary to that is that we have to keep we can't just leave it and say that's, well, we've done it, so that's good enough. We have to keep working on it. We have to keep developing it, and we have to keep refining it, and we have to keep going with it. I mean, e- every uh, every so often, we on the editorial team at Advances in Simulation look at our article types, and we refine them, recraft them, rewrite them, or sometimes come up with completely new article types. And the idea is very much in that vein of how do we keep um, how do we ensure that we're continuing to um, kind of give people guidelines to support the work that they do and support disseminating their good work to the larger community, so that we are building that knowledge generation kind of engine, and pushing the field forward. And I think an example of this, at least in my mind, is a lot of journals have some kind, especially in applied fields like ours, have some kind of practice report option for manuscripts where you can say, I did this really great thing. Here's what it looked like. Nobody else has ever done this before, at least that I can find. It's a great kind of if you have these same kind of trainees, you could do a sim like this, and here's how you can do it. And we said, actually, what we want to do is take that kind of up a level, and push people's thinking even further than here's this cool thing we did. And so, as an example, we came up with the article type advancing simulation practice, and we've been really, really pleased with how that's played out in the journal over the last couple of years, because what it's done for people is actually encourage them, and it provides a standard that to which our peer reviewers can easily, with which they can easily engage, and our editors as well. you know and we can remind authors as well when they submit a manuscript, like, go back and look at, here's the standard for what we expect. We want to move it beyond, here's something cool we did, and here's how you do that. You talk about what you did, but you talk about it in the context of what are the design principles that are associated with this, and why did you make these choices? What kind of choices could you possibly have made differently? What kind of data do you have that helps you understand the intervention that you designed, and that maybe helps you continue to develop it for the future? And what are the lessons that you've learned and that you would encourage other people to think about? So it really kind of pushes from here's this cool thing we did to and here's what it means, and here's what it potentially means for other people. So I think things like continually refining standards can up our game, individually, but can also push the field ahead, which I think is really important.
When we collectively refine standards, it seems to me a couple things are happening as I listen to you, Gabe. One is we're surfacing our existing standards, what counts as good.
Mm.
Just being able to do that itself in certain contexts is actually quite heretical. Um, when you have a very closed organization or a very closed system, or loyalty is the premier standard versus meritocracy or something else, even naming that loyalty is the standard, or uh, making the standard itself discussable, is often difficult in certain settings. So I think what you've suggested here implicitly, again, is a sign of a healthy community of practice is the ability to surface what are our standards, and are they still right? Do we want to look at them? And I think what's so tricky about this, Gabe, is identity is involved. So,
Absolutely.
when I struggled with my inner grammando, like, you mean I have to let go of being on my high horse about that grammar rule? It's partially like, hey, I worked really hard on my education. I worked really hard to learn all those grammar rules. I'm a accomplished person because I know the grammar. And now you're telling me it doesn't matter, and my identity as being like a well-read person doesn't matter. That's like threatening. And so similarly, I think when we thought this was a good article type, or we thought this was the type of person we wanted to hire, another example, and we're going to examine that standard, and we're going to maybe blow it up, that could include blowing up certain people's identities. So what I want to wrap up and discuss with you sort of as our last topic here, Gabe, is kind of the role of these standards in building communities of practice. And a community of practice is a group of people who work together on a common type of project, or a common career, or a common hobby. It could be fixing Xerox machines. That's how the concept originally arose. Or it could be academics like you and me, or it could be managers, or it could be instructional designers, whatever you have. And so, what I'm interested in your thoughts on is, how can we use the evolution of standards, but also the articulation of standards, to strengthen our communities of practice?
Um, Jenny, I think it's a really I think you've touched on something that's really important, and I just if I can, I'll relate a story that a good friend and colleague of mine who's a critical care physician. I remember relaying a story about meetings in which he and his colleagues were getting, they got quite emotional and quite kind of intense as they were discussing treatment options for some of their patients. And because it is central to their identity that they are able to kind of make those decisions. They see themselves as able to, they're experts in their fields. When you get to the attending or consultant level, we call it in the UK, when you get to this level where the expectation is, the entirety, the holism of the professional judgment sits within my kind of purview. That's my identity. That's what I'm supposed to do. And any challenges to that are really quite, well, as the word you said earlier, I think is a good one, destabilizing. It can be quite kind of confronting. And I think the flip side of that is that what we see in groups and communities and organizations where we start having those conversations above the table, where we say, actually, let's start talking about what we mean when we say these things. They have the potential benefit of not just kind of allowing people to participate in a different way, in a way that is, and to use the communities of practice kind of model. It draws people in from the periphery at all levels of their kind of training and allows them to participate in the shared endeavor. Whether that's how do we make treatment decisions in intensive care, critical care, or whether it's how do we decide which manuscripts we're going to publish or what those manuscripts look like, or whether it's how do we decide what a good advocacy inquiry looks like or a good debriefing looks like in our sim center. So it draws people in to that process. It helps them kind of participate in a meaningful way, but it also helps make explicit those things that often are they're sort of veiled, they're implicit, they're implied, they're not talked about. And if you try and pick them apart, people go, no, 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 you can't do that, you can't, don't ask me to justify that, it's just this thing that is. And so in kind of stripping off the veil, we you know, I think we allow people to participate in a different way and in a more meaningful way. I think the other thing, one of the as I was thinking about this topic before we sat down together, I was thinking about how much work went into the development of the AIR, the advocacy inquiry rubric, which you detail really well in the manuscript as well. And I was thinking about the various rubrics that I've been associated with and how much effort it takes to make to encode them, right, to articulate this is what we mean by these standards, this is what competence looks like, or this is what really good behavior or good performance looks like. And I think, that's one of the things that's so challenging about shared standards is that they have all of these potential benefits, but actually they're really hard to make happen. They take a lot of effort. And then you put all that effort in, and then you go, gosh, Gabe and Jenny just said I got to do it again because, it keeps changing, right? Our practice keeps changing. And I think the thing to keep in mind for me is that the value of doing it is so high that it's worth the effort, and the potential that it provides of kind of bringing people in and ironically, I think making that training and development, making people able to achieve the standard and understand the standard, and engage with the standards, it makes that process more efficient because anytime you can clearly see what the standards are. I mean, we know from 100 years of research in instructional design and other sort of aspects of educational psychology. When people know what the standard is and they're able to judge their own work against the standard, they're able to meet the standard much more efficiently, and the work gets there quicker. And goodness knows that's what we want in healthcare, right? We don't want to be holding people back and help and creating, like, forcing them to imagine what we want them to do. Actually, what we want is them to have a clear line of sight of this is how I get to be really good at taking care of my patients and providing safe, high quality care so that I can do that as quickly as possible. And I think that's really important kind of as a guiding light for us to remember.
So, pulling together some of your observations, Gabe, with also some of the interesting work that's out there on standards. And I'll mention again the paper by Amy Edmondson and Diana McLean Smith called
Mm.
Too Hot to Handle, which contrasts when the standards are vague versus when we know what we are aiming toward. You said that building a standard is worth the work, and you were referring to a formal rubric, for example. But what I'd like to sort of end with for us is in a meeting where we're having a spicy argument or discussion, and we can't seem to get any traction. It is often because I'm appealing to standard A and you're appealing to standard B, and we don't even know that we're
Mhm.
disagreeing on these hidden underlying different things. And what I heard in your comments, Gabe, was the very process of surfacing what are the elements of what we care about or don't care about can bring us together as people, even if it illuminates our differences. When we're able to look at them in a respectful, curious, cool way, we get such a better appreciation of what each other are up against and what we need to work on. And so I think that's the power of kind of the everyday standard, which is, how do I move toward that? So Gabe, I'm going to wrap up with our um, workout of the week. And then after that, I'd love for you to throw in any thought or final closing comments you have about it. So our workout of the week this week is basically try to be a cognitive detective or a cognitive feeling detective and figure out what standard or standards are being appealed to in a meeting that you might be having. What standard or standards might be being appealed to in a meeting that you might be having. Um, and you're going to be able to detect when to look for these if you see some of the following, like irritation, disappointment, you feel judgment, or the opposite, like the team is just moving forward with beautiful traction and there's a sense of camaraderie and clarity. It might be because there is a shared standard, but you can just do standard detecting whether it's a horrible meeting that you can't wait to get out of or it's a fantastic meeting you wish you had more of. So your workout of the week is try to be a detective and find out what's the standard going on within a meeting. And Gabe Reedy, just wanted to thank you again so much for joining us, taking time out of your busy day, and love to give you the last word here if you have one.
Well, thanks, Jenny. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. And I guess the thing that just comes to mind as you're saying that is that, of course, that is what we're constantly doing as human beings. Your inner commando is not a Jenny Rudolph unique situation or a Gabe Reedy unique thing. We're programmed to look at the world around us and make judgments constantly. And the thing that as you quite rightly pointed out, the very human thing that we also do is we fail to articulate the basis for which those judgments are made sometimes. And so I love that workout suggestion, and I think I'm going to try it this week too.